I've been a huge fan of Thresh ever since his release, but I was never a good Thresh player until recently. After my first 20 games in ranked, my win rate was abysmal, somewhere in the 20 to 30% range. If you know me, you'll know that I'm extremely hard on myself and I'm not satisfied with being bad at something. So, instead of sulking around, I studied all the best Thresh players in the world. Madlife, Mata, Mondu, Edward, Xpecial, you name it. I watched replay after replay to figure out what I was doing wrong, and after putting in a lot of hard work, I've finally gotten to the point where I can truthfully say that I'm a good Thresh player. I'm here today to teach you all what I've learned so you can channel the souls of your victims into godlike Thresh plays. So, without further ado, let's get into the guide. We'll start off with Masteries, which aren't set in stone for most people yet. Support players haven't come to an agreement on which Masteries setup is the best for supports, and I'm personally still bouncing back and forth between 3 different pages. The first page is a heavy utility build that supports a strong early laning phase via Wealth, Alchemist, Culinary Master, and extra health from Veteran Scars, while also providing a lot of roam potential through Wanderer and Fleet of Foot. The second page is a heavy defensive build that aims to transform you into a super tank in the mid to late game, while also providing you with a lot of lane dominance through extra defensive stats and regeneration. The third page is essentially a mix of the two, focusing heavily on lane dominance through extra defensive stats and an extra health potion through Wealth. I don't think that any one of these pages is the ultimate best, and I alternate between all 3 pages depending on the game. I like the first page against easier lanes because while it lacks defensive stats, it allows you to roam much more effectively and generate more gold as well. I like the second page when I'm playing against burst lanes because the extra armor magic resist from Legendary Guardian works wonders. And lastly, I like the third page when I'm playing against poke lanes because it provides me with defensive stats while also providing me with extra sustain through the extra health potion level 1. Next up are runes, which I think are pretty standard across the board for most Thresh players. Attack damage reds are great because Flay scales with attack damage, and Thresh can also harass pretty well with auto attacks. As for seals, armor is really efficient and it does well against AD carries. Same goes for MR blues, except it's going to be the support dealing the magical damage for the most part. 2 health quints because health is one of the best sources of effective health in the early game, and 1 armor quint to make up for not having armor reds. Against high range AD carries like Caitlyn, it's okay to run armor reds because it's difficult to harass them with auto attacks when their range is so much longer than yours. Something else that's also useful is swapping out 6 MR blues for flat CDR blues, which can be run against low magic damage lanes. If you run with one of the mastery pages that has 5% CDR, this will give you 10% CDR from runes and masteries, which you can combine with Shirelius and lock it for 40% CDR. Now we'll get into item builds, which is where things start to get a little complicated, except for starting items. Starting items aren't complicated because Doran's Shield is just too damn good to consider buying anything else. The stats alone are worth 624 gold, and then you also have to consider the absurd passive that it has. After the Doran's Shield, things start to get a little interesting. I'll start off by saying that I think the Pumondu style of Thresh where you rush 40% CDR is superior to all other builds, so my item choices here are going to reflect that. Keep in mind that because we're aiming for 40% CDR, mastery pages have a big influence on how we're going to itemize. So, that being said, let's talk about the 0921 page first, which has 5% CDR and an extra 6.5% movement speed out of combat. Your core items are going to be Sightstone, Boots of Lucidity, and Shirelius. Boots of Lucidity and Shirelius gives you 40% CDR, and Sightstone gives you all the wards you need, along with a little extra survivability. The order in which you pick up these core items is dependent on what lane you're playing against, so let's talk about priorities. Against a high burst lane, you generally want to prioritize Health Crystal over Medallion, over Boots 1, over Shirelius, over Sightstone, over Boots of Lucidity. Survival is key here, and an early Health Crystal is the best thing you can buy. I like to prioritize Shirelius as the first big item because it's extremely versatile. It gives you the ability to escape engages or force engages bottom with the help of your jungler. Against a high poke lane, you generally want to prioritize Medallion over Health Crystal, over Shirelius, over Boost of Lucidity, over Sightstone. Not only does Shirelius provide you with a good amount of health regen to out-sustain the poke, but it also allows you to force engages on the enemy lane before getting poked out. After your core items are completed, look to buy tanky items like Sunfire, Randuin's, or Banshee's Veil depending on the situation. Support items like Mikhail's or Locket can also be useful in certain situations, but I generally prefer to pick up tank items instead. The next mastery page I want to talk about is the 423.3 page. The endgame items will remain the same, so we'll keep those there, but we have to switch up the core items. For starters, if I don't have 21 points in utility, I want to pick up mobility boost to keep up my roaming potential. What this means is I need to make up for 35% CDR. I like to do this by running an extra 5% CDR on my runes, as well as picking up Shirelius and Locket. However, because Locket isn't always a good pickup, I don't want to include it in the core items list. I will instead say that it's a very good pickup if the situation calls for it, because you can actually benefit from the CDR it provides. While 40% CDR is really good, it's important to not tunnel on one stat while ignoring everything else. The priorities for picking up these items are almost identical to the previous setup. Against burst lanes you want to prioritize health, and against poke lanes you want to prioritize sustain and engage. The last mastery page to go over is the 01614 page. Because this page doesn't have 21 points in utility and it also doesn't have any CDR, we're put in quite a bad position in terms of meeting our CDR goal. We're essentially forced into picking up mobility boost to keep up our roaming, but that leaves us with a 40% CDR deficit right off the bat. We'll pick up Shirelius and Sightstone for obvious reasons, but that still leaves us 20% short. We'll come back to that later, but first let's lay out our priorities for this build. Again, the priorities are going to look nearly identical here. I'll avoid sounding like a broken record and just allow you all a moment to look them over. Our endgame item list looks similar to before as well, including Randuin's, Sunfire, Banshee's Veil, Locket, and Mikhail's. What's different is that we need to make up for that 20% CDR at some point, and the best way to do that is through items like Frozen Heart, Spirit Visage, or Zeke's Herald. Just keep in mind that you only want to pick up one of these items, and that you may not want to pick them up immediately after your core items. Frozen Heart generally isn't a good first pickup because it lacks health, and Zeke's Herald is only good in certain team comps. Spirit Visage is a great pickup versus heavy magic damage, and the health regeneration is great for sieging as well. Next up is skill order, which is usually pretty simple for most champions, but there's still a lot of disagreement amongst Thresh players. Some players max Q, some players max W, some players max E, some players put 3 points in E and then max Q, some players put 3 points in E and then max W. There are a lot of different options. I've tried all of these and I prefer the Pumondu strategy of maxing Death Sentence and then Lantern. This skill order results in a worse early game, but a much better mid to late game with a lower cooldown Death Sentence and Lantern. Another skill order that I think is good is taking 2 to 3 points in Flay early and then continuing with the previous skill order. This removes the bad early game while slightly delaying your power spike in the mid to late game. Now that we've gone through all the pregame information, let's get into some in-game tips for playing Thresh. I can immediately tell if someone is a Thresh player by their usage of Flay. A good Thresh player will backwards Flay for harass, while inexperienced players will constantly look for a hook instead. The truth is that while hooking first looks cooler and gives your AD carry more time to beat up on the victim, it's much less reliable and a backwards Flay almost guarantees a hook afterwards. During laning phase, you want to threaten the range of your Flay and make the enemy lane respect you. Also, I suppose this is a good time to say, practice your backwards Flays. Practice your flash Flays too. I know it's hard, but you have to learn how to do these with a high success rate or else you're massively gimping your potential. The other very important thing about Flay is that you can interrupt displacement abilities with it. This means that you can interrupt Jarvan's Flag and Drag combo, Leona's Zenith Blade, Kha'Zix's Leap, Tristana's Rocket Jump, and more abilities. This is a very important skill to master, especially when you're playing against a Leona, who is a very popular and very strong pick at the moment. If you're unable to interrupt her Zenith Blade, then she's going to run all over you, but if you can interrupt it, you can easily turn around trades in your favor. The next piece of information that's crucial is that you often don't want to activate the second part of your Death Sentence. When you hook a target, it puts them in a disadvantageous position and keeps you out of harm's way. When you fire your target, you often put yourself in a bad position as well and step in harm's way when it's not necessary. This isn't to say that you should never activate the second portion, because sometimes it can be useful to get in position for a multiple person Flay or a good box in a team fight. But one of the biggest problems I see in lower tier Thresh players is that they're almost always flying to their target when it's not necessary and putting themselves in a bad position. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can cast spells while your chain is attached to someone, meaning that you can hook, box, pull them into the box, then Flay afterwards, which makes great use of the box without flying into the enemy team. The next thing I want to talk about is the purpose of this build, because I've talked a lot about the importance of maxing Q and getting 40% CDR, but I haven't explained why it's so good yet. At rank 5, Death Sentence has a 12-second cooldown. 40% CDR reduces this to 7.2 seconds, and on top of that, if Death Sentence hits, the cooldown is reduced by 3 seconds, bringing the cooldown down to 4.2 seconds. Also consider that it's a 1.5 second stun, which means that after your stun wears off, you're able to hook again 2.7 seconds later. This means that when you're sieging a tower, you're able to constantly throw hooks out on their frontline and chunk their health. Normally hooking a frontline target isn't a big deal, but because you're able to hook them again almost immediately after, it becomes extremely deadly extremely fast. This isn't just good for sieging either, it's amazing for peel in teamfights. A 1.5 second stun on a 4.2 second cooldown is pretty absurd, and when used correctly, it's just blatantly overpowered. Now that we've talked about how good Death Sentence is, let's talk a bit about the mind game of hooks and how to improve our accuracy with them. For starters, it's important to realize that all players are different and it's your job as a Thresh player to get in their head and figure out what they're thinking and how they're going to move. Every single hook is information. Use that information to download your opponents. The first mind game I want to talk about is my favorite, and I would say it's by far the most successful. Because Thresh's hook has an abnormally long delay, he has the benefit of not facing the direction that the hook flies in. This means that you can face one direction and hook somewhere else completely, which is exactly the basis of the trick. If there are two targets in front of you, you want to aim at the one that you aren't trying to hook, because when you don't look at someone, they don't think that you're going to hook them and then they don't prepare for it. Dodging skill shots is part reaction and part anticipation. So if you take away the anticipation factor, the odds of landing their skill shot are much higher. The next trick is usually what I catch a lot of good players with, and that's predicting the juke forward. Instead of leading the hook behind them like you would normally, you lead the hook in front of them instead, and because they're preemptively juking forward to dodge the hook, they end up running right into it. As I said before, every hook is information, so make sure you're adjusting your play accordingly. The last mind game is what everyone likes to call the mad life, which is where you predict the enemy's flash or gap closer by throwing your hook the max distance of their escape. So, for instance, if you're trying to hook Ezreal, you want to throw your hook where he'll end up with Arcane Shift, because players will wait until the hook windup goes through and then use their escape and panic. If you're chasing someone like an Ezreal, it's always worth a shot because they're going to use their Arcane Shift to avoid it anyway, so you might as well throw out a Hail Mary. In addition to Death Sentence, Thresh's Lantern is also pretty overpowered in the right hands and has a ton of uses. In teamfights, you generally want to use a Lantern just for the AoE shield, but outside of that, you can use lanterns to make picks around the map or assist in bot lane ganks. As Thresh, you want to be roaming around the map as much as possible, at least after laning phase is over. Thresh is one of the best pick champions in the game because he's able to catch someone with Death Sentence and then bring in one of his teammates with Lantern. Along with making picks, he's also able to completely turn around bad situations if he's there with Lantern, which is why it's absolutely crucial that you have either mobility boots or the extra speed from the utility tree. You want to be all over the map frustrating the enemy team with lanterns and having your team sing your praises with hooks. Thresh is a playmaker, and you need to have the confidence to make plays and the presence of mind to be in the right place at the right time. Thresh is one of my favorite champions, and it's my hope that this guy will help you enjoy him as much as I do. There's no doubt in my mind that if you follow this guide and put in some hard work, you can become a Thresh master too. If there's anything that you think I can improve on in this format, please let me know in the comment section below. Also, feel free to check out my full-length Diamond 1 Thresh commentary, which I'll have an annotation to somewhere on the screen right now. If you have any questions about the guide or any questions regarding anything at all, please ask me in the comment section below or tweet at me. Thank you all for watching, and as always, good luck in your games, and I'll see you all next time.